In English, by the way. I think that was very much appreciated because it was a fascinating conversation and I'm very eager to meet her. Yeah. All right, so now to this. So I'm going to show you guys a little over a decade of work. So it's going to be kind of an adventure, but I figure visual aids are always enjoyable. And it'll kind of take less pressure off me to talk too much. So that is also helpful as well. And so this piece is from 2003, and it's the organ donor vending machine. And this is a close-up. And you could, and it was fully functioning. Sadly, I couldn't get the video to work, so you'll just have to imagine with me. But there is a tray, an automated tray, that actually goes up kind of like an elevator, and then there are conveyor belts. So it was a vending machine from the 70s, so it was very old school, fully automated, kind of that like home of the future kind of technology of like, oh, look how fancy this is, it's doing everything for me. And so then people could purchase an organ of their choice from the vending machine. And also a part of the series, this was actually a solo exhibition that I had called Directions for Use. And it was based along the lines of questionable medical technology and the sort of quick fixes to your health and vitality and better living through medicine, which was kind of a false advertising, more or less. And this is the brain protein system, which would administer brain protein as you rode your moped to work. Very useful. Here's one of my many long-suffering friends that has to be a model. You'll see a lot of that guy behind you in the corner. And there was a little mini promo commercial where the brain just pulsated to show how much smarter you were getting from the brain protein. And this was a fun series called Startup Kits for Supervillains. And I wanted to make little, quick startup kits for the aspiring supervillain. And this was a thought control helmet. And it came with labeling and simple directions for use. Thus came the title of that exhibition. And there's some more kits. And then this was just the inserts that were inside explaining what each of them were there for. This was just the universal syringe, something a supervillain has to have. Hypnotic control goggles, if thought control doesn't work. An instant minion army. Multi-purpose ray gun, super happy child. Universal remote for all of your detonation needs. Yes.
Was this shown as posters or?
It was the little, if we'll go back to this guy, which thank you, by the way. I invite anybody to ask questions. No, it's good. It's good. But yeah, there are these little guys here. And then we'll go through. And then here comes the sweat-sucking business suit for people that have perspiration problems, because this is super subtle and nobody will ever see what's happening. And then there's the sweat backpack in the back there. And this is just showing how it's totally normal. You can go about your daily life.
But you have clothes outside or is that?
No, that's the suit.
It's actually one from the private.
Yeah. Well, it gets sweaty too.
Yeah.
And it's at the office. Yeah, it's totally relaxed. Yeah, just go about your daily activities. Totally normal. And this was a piece that I had at the International Museum of Surgical Sciences in Chicago, which is this delightfully strange museum kind of medical oddities. It was more a cabinet of curiosity museum. And these were sort of IKEA version transplant organs. So they were very streamlined, very aesthetically pleasing. These were lungs. And then we had the heart. And these were actually, I carved these out of a industrial prototyping foam. And then they're all automotive spray paint with like a clear coat finish, with kind of the idea that it was like this slick hot rod kind of finish to all of them. And these are the corporation posters. This is my personal favorite, the kidneys, because they were just so bloody adorable. And now we come to persistent adaptation, which kind of marked sort of a change in path for me as far as the work that I was doing. I started to gravitate more towards ecology and the natural world and plant life, but it was still firmly planted in the artificial at this point. So this was me creating a version of what I saw. These are actually deconstructed and reconstructed children's toys. So I was trying to imagine, because, you know, children are lovely, but they're also full of lots of diseases and other things. And so when they're playing and rolling around, I was trying to imagine what sort of bacteria would be cultivated inside of these balloons. And I have a soft spot for fungi in general, so I did a lot of sourcing as far as that was concerned visually. And then this is what I created, and these are, this piece consists of, I believe, 40,000 balloons. They're, of course, not inflated, but these were actually what clowns use to make balloon animals.
Which year was this?
This was 2008, so we've skipped a bit. We skipped a couple of years because the last exhibition, the one at the Museum of Surgical Sciences, was 2006. And that's what the interiors of the balloons looked like. And I actually built false panels on the interior, so it would look like you could actually see like a root system starting to occur. And there's the inside of that one, which hilariously enough, many people said they looked like potatoes. So that's a full circle. Maybe not the color, at least, but yeah, that seems a little more accurate. Maybe people just don't know what potatoes look like. And then this is the full installation, and this piece on the lower end is called The Colony. This whole show was actually called Manifest Destiny. And the idea of how we're creating environments in which it's very, very friendly for bacteria and other strange life forms to sort of start co-opting, annexing our space in a good way. And also I'm heavily influenced by the ocean, the deep ocean, coral reefs. I've always had a fascination with those. So that's a lot of what this visual imagery is coming from. And this sort of points directly to my obsession with using very mundane objects to construct pieces. These areas right here, all the circles are actually garden hose that I sliced into sections to create the coral foundation. And then there's rubber bands and hot glue, and artificial turf. And the forms themselves are actually plumbing parts.
And how big are they?
This guy right here is probably the tall, like about around there, yeah. There they are, just kind of hanging out. And obviously I think I have a lot of stories about children enjoying my work more than anything else, but there was a great part of this, like at the opening, this little girl came in and sat down in the middle of the floor and pulled out her My Pretty Pony and just started like riding it across the landscape, which was really, really delightful. And there's the last detail. And then this was just cast in a silicone mold with the hot glue and the rubber bands placed directly in. And here we have mimicry, which I'm starting to push a little bit further into the sort of idea of plant adaptation, mutation, ways in which they find changes in the environment and adapt accordingly. This was more actually about the idea of that if plants were a little bit more like us, we would be kinder to them, which is kind of ironic because it's probably not true. But they're just, they're just trying. Right now there's just a little bit of hair starting to grow in areas of the piece. And there's the larger installation shot. But see, it's sort of like fleshy. It's kind of hard to see in this, on the screen here, like where that maybe is a little bit easier to see because it's like starting to be a little skin and hair. So it's just in sections starting to look a little bit human, but not really. And I actually like to show different installation shots of my work because I frequently respond to the environment. So the architectural environment. And I kind of feel like they're a new piece every time if I slightly alter them to fit into the space. And so this was the piece installed elsewhere. Slightly different, and I always add and take away a few components just to fit the work into the space.
What materials are
It is this part is clay and wax and felting, and most of this is wax, and then there's actually some deconstructed artificial flowers that I just took apart, dipped, and then remodeled over an armature that made the sort of the bulbous form there. And they're all just sort of scampering up the wall. And then this piece, hilariously enough, was a piece that I did at an art center called Soap Factory. And they commission artists every year to do a room in what they call the haunted basement. So they have people on throughout October, they get to tour the basement, and it's supposed to be terrorizing, which honestly mine wasn't that terrorizing, but I really wanted the dark space. So I decided to do this piece, which is, and to give you an idea of scale, this piece right here, it's about 10 feet high, and then the room itself was 17 feet by 10 feet. I don't know, I should be better at conversions at this point. Okay. And then this is just a detail, and it went back, like the depth of the piece was probably around 6 feet in depth. So like from here to where I'm sitting, so it kind of could surround people. And then the piece itself is actually twine, wax tape, and then UV reactive paint. And so then it was activated with strobes. So this is actually where you see this sort of blue, what was happening. And I learned to be much better at videotaping I was not at the first part of my career of doing things that kind of needed to have video taken for people to understand. But the strobes created sort of this lightning bolt that sort of went through the entire neural matrix, which actually I called it neuromorphic behavior. That was that title. And this was 2010. And then there's just a detail. So this is the piece, this is a piece called, oh wow, Galactic Scale. Sorry, I was like, I hate when I forget the titles of my own work. That's very embarrassing. But so this was a photographic series that I created, actually with in mind. I was starting to see interesting aspects of environmental changes, like off the coast of Japan, where the jellyfish were starting to become large because of environmental changes and eliminating a lot of the predatory aspects that was keeping the population under control and also not allowing them to grow to inordinate sizes. So I decided to sort of create my own life form that was exploring that very thing of becoming too large for your environment. And these pieces were cast agar, which is what's used in cell cultures. So it would, it looked very fleshy, and that kind of comes across in the photographs here. It's a very fleshy substance, but then it would start to deteriorate along with, it was a good way to cultivate a lot of mold and bacteria, so it just started inherently changing on its own. And I had it on a scanner bed, so I would take scans of it intermittently throughout the process and alter it a little bit to kind of create this fictional life cycle. And this is a planetary orbit graph from a Popular Science 1908 encyclopedia that I got. And then we can just, it's almost like it's animated. And and you can see that it's starting, there's a lot of nasty business starting to grow on there, starting to decay pretty quickly. And then now we have Gating the Return of Echoes, which was a part of a fellowship that I got for emerging artists in 2011. And this piece is we'll go forward here. This was actually called Rescue Supply Capsule. So I was looking at World War II, food replenishing, parachuting in capsules. And this is sort of the idea that it's some sort of unknown entity in the future that needs to have this particular supply sent to them, with this strange sort of fungal growth inside. And there it is. There it is up close. And I liked the sort of nonsensical aspect of combining, the parachute is sort of, in the midst of falling down, but then I patinaed the copper finish as though it had been in the ocean. And these are actually 20,000 Q-tips, correct? Whoever guessed that, yes. And then it's hooked up to these, what I kind of think of as a very overly complicated map, a homing device, for it to be able to find its way to whatever location it needs to go. And these were actually taken from a circuit board plan, and then I created a model, and these were actually done with a 3D printer. And it was an early adaptation of the technology, so sadly, I could only print out like this large of squares. So I had to then reconstruct it into the larger board, which is about 2 by 4 feet. And we'll get a few details here. And then it's actually got iron oxide and sand finish so that it looked like it was sort of something that was unearthed from an archaeological dig. There's a textural detail there. This does not work, or I would show you a little bit of technical difficulty with PowerPoint. And then this is actually just, I like to play around with seeing how totally different conceptual orientations play when they're put together. And I actually thought galactic scale and gating the return of echoes maybe would work really interestingly together and then eliminate the supply drop. So this is another exhibition where I had them pieced together that way. And you will see this is a normal theme of mine, that things change from being on the wall, to from the ceiling, to being on the floor. I like to use all surfaces. All right, and this is called Survival Tactics. And this was actually the first piece that I did any programming with and started working with Arduinos and microcontrollers. This was actually at the top floor of the soap factory, which is this beautiful old warehouse space. And the idea with Survival Tactics was I became very interested in plant communication. And in this particular instance, it was focused on root systems and how when they become dehydrated, they actually have like a variable vibration to them. And this is still something that's in research, and I believe it's being mostly researched for agricultural purposes, so they can start to have some prediction to when a drought might be endangering crop areas. And so we'll get there I am, for scale. And fingers crossed, yes, that the video works. And so these are all moving because there's tiny vibration motors in the tips of them that are being controlled by relays and a microcontroller. And we'll and these are sort of choreographed, so they are kind of in a dance with each other, like each section. And that's the way they're communicating back and forth through the sound of this vibration too. But I wanted to have a rhythm to it, so it actually looked like each section was actually communicating with the other one. And they all kind of had their own special dance moves. And they're actually on plates, so when people, and audience members could stand on the plates so they could feel the vibration. Yeah. And they get kind of fighty with each other, so they can be a little aggressive. And there was sort of the idea of where the bulbs are the starting point of the roots. And it was actually that loud in the space. It was pretty deafening. It actually sounded like you were in a beehive. And that's that guy. And then I actually reinstalled it in a different formation. I kind of liked this formation and wanted to include it because it felt really aggressive to me. They almost looked like they were on a march. So I wanted to play around with the idea of like when they're clustered, do they become more of a threat than when they're actually spaced apart, making them a little bit more harmless. And that doesn't work, so we're gonna skip it. And then finally, this was actually in a group show. I should have included the video of how the ceiling worked because it was actually the best part of the piece. The ceiling in this space is it's fully automated. It's on hydraulics. So it goes all the way to like 2 feet off the ground. So then you can hang things from there and it goes all the way back up. It's pretty magical. I actually wish all ceilings were like that in every place. And then there's just a view of that. And this was actually this space's ceilings were really quite high. I think they were 35 feet. And I threw this in here because it might be a piece that someday exists. It's still in the back of my mind. It's still actually setting in my studio. It's a model. I have a very soft spot for rock and minerals and just geology in general. And so this was just a little test that I was creating. At the time I was thinking of the Ode to the Fortress of Solitude, the Superman's house. And just trying to figure out where to go from there, but it didn't really actually go anywhere, and I didn't have any conceptual purpose for it, but it's still there. It's still sitting in my studio, and maybe I'll figure out what it means eventually. But these were small cast resin pieces that had a little bit of dye in them. And this was actually what's growing out of here is inspired by the fungus that infects insects, and it actually it creates zombie insects. I wish I could remember what the fungus was called, but I cannot. So it takes control of like the infected insect, and then eventually it lays its eggs and they like erupt from the insect. That's right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry, it's always dangerous. This is why I never allow you to come to talks. And here's another view. All right, and now this is the first permutation of the piece that's actually upstairs. So this is when I first started working with algae. Spirulina, actually cyanobacteria in this case. Gets complicated though, it's actually algae upstairs with some cyanobacteria. But we'll go to here. And this is all algae within these sacs. These started out as weather balloons. I actually adapted the piece going forward because it wasn't a very suitable environment for the algae. They didn't like it very much. So they didn't last very long. And these, I feel like I'll just kind of go through all of this so you can see the stages, and then we'll get to the most recent, the piece that's actually up at the museum right now, which is more closely connected to the one that's upstairs, so you guys will be able to see the video and kind of see how it functions. And this area right here is actually where replacement algae is being cultivated to put in once, and because they're bubbling like a lot, they need to be aerated. They evaporate eventually, so I do have to replace the spirulina, the cyanobacteria, regardless of whether it's dying or not. Like sometimes it's for bad reasons because it died in the bag and I have to replace the sample. Other times it's just because it's part of its life cycle that it eventually evaporates. And you will notice that with each permutation of my piece, I get a little bit more dramatic or obsessive about the tubing components, which is one of my favorite visual tropes, because I love that connection to sci-fi, of it being like, if there's a mess of tubing and wires, then something very high-tech is happening. So we'll go through that. And you can see some of them like are a little bit healthier than others.
Can you say something about the form of these?
The sacs? Yeah. Yes. Well, I love the idea that they have this, like, first of all, it is a pod or like a cultivation pod. I also like the more like strange breakdown of a more like sexualized plant life, because all they are created for is to reproduce. So I like the aspect of that it all has this like sex organ components to it. So I mean, inappropriately probably, I refer to them as my gyrating scrotums in the face. Sorry. And there were 52 bags in this installation. And so what's going to happen now is there's actually a CO2 sensor in that microphone apparatus. And so it's evaluating my CO2 levels, which everyone has a slightly different CO2 level. So each time the pumps go like through this pattern, this sort of conversation, it's slightly different for everyone that breathes into it, because it has a slightly different data arc as far as levels of CO2. Sometimes it can be very slight, sometimes it can be really dramatic difference. And then all of those were suspended from like a cable matrix system that we went across the gallery, the two adjacent walls with, which I'd never done before and was very challenging engineering for me, actually. And there's one more pass. And as you can see, like this was actually a little bit later on, it had been up for a week and a half or so. So what happens is some of the spray, like as it's bubbling, actually almost beaches the algae, so to speak. So it has this sort of tidal mark. So those are just all details of the museum piece. And that brings us to the algae that is upstairs, which is actually green algae. And there are only 2 sacs that are cyanobacteria. And then the rest of it is local Norwegian algae that we were fortunate enough to make contact with a PhD student, Akumi, that is in the University of Southeast Norway. Okay. And she helped cultivate the algae, which was really fantastic because it would have been extremely difficult to get it through customs, if not impossible. Probably impossible. But this is my algae. This is the algae that's upstairs. That's the strain. And that's what it looks like under a microscope, which is because it is actually genuine algae in a more sophisticated organism. It's actually a single-celled organism. And the spirulina, which is the cyanobacteria that I've been using for the other pieces, this is what it looks like underneath the microscope, and it's a much more primitive life form. It's actually so primitive that it helped cultivate the atmosphere that we can breathe in today. It's been around for a long time. And these are my cultivation tanks this is what they look like currently today, like only a couple of hours ago. And this is full of the cyanobacteria. This is my friend taking a selfie with the algae. And this is Akumi, and this is at the beginning when we were mixing up the algae to actually put in the bags. And she brought fertilizer and medium because they actually need to have nutrients to mix in the bags. And this is her mixing up the fertilizer right now. And this is the two of us posing, pretending to be algae bags in front of the algae.
That's nice.
And that is it. Thank you.
We have so many questions.
I'm sure you do.
No, because you touched this a little bit when you talk about the tubes that you hang around the installations.
Yeah.
Because you have like multi-inspirations for your work, which I find very interesting. It's not only the cultivation of algae,
No.
it's not only that it represents something that's very interesting in asking, but it's also other approaches that you have to your work. So like when we create the installation upstairs, we always like, you knew how to set the light, you knew how to do everything because you wanted to create a special atmosphere.
Yeah.
And lots of it comes from different stuff, but the sci-fi thing is really there.
Yeah.
Could you like explain a bit more on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, for whatever reason, my gateway drug into science was science fiction. And so it's always been a huge inspiration to me. I also find a lot of inspiration in cinema in general, because especially I too kind of am trying to set the stage, so to speak, because I want people to go into an environment and actually experience it and have sort of their cinematic moment, and to become a part of that narrative or become a part of that film. And sci-fi has been really fascinating to me, but I also find that it's a beautiful way to present a spectacle. And it has a lot of really concise and inspiring commentary on humanity. Actually, the thing that I forgot to tell anyone, well, I have told people, but the communication that's going on with the pumps, like the rhythm of the sound, I actually took inspiration from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Have any of you guys ever? Yeah. And so it's when they start communicating with the mothership, and actually the guy who helped me program the Arduino, we had a really bizarre moment where we were just bleep, bleep, bloop, bleep, bloop, back at each other to try to figure out like what the coding needed to be to have like the specific sound. And so it was a fun time. But then I finally was like, okay, Max, just we're watching the clip. So I like pulled up the clip of them starting communication with the mothership, and he was like, I understand. And he did it.
It's a lot about like we're sitting in a library that we have called Sympoiesis, which means do together.
Mm-hmm.
And the word we have borrowed from Donna Haraway.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks a lot about storytelling. And I think your work is a lot about storytelling too.
Yeah.
Like you tell different stories in there.
Sometimes, like all the time, totally different stories. It's an ever-evolving narrative thread. No, I do think that narrative is really important, and the aspect of telling a story, and in some strange ways, I become really attached to the materials that I'm using, and that's sort of an entry point to the story that I tell. It's been really fascinating for me to start to work with a living organism, because it forges like a much different, much stranger connection with the piece that you're working on. Because pieces in the past, you always hope for the best, hope that it doesn't have some sort of technical problem. But with this, I fear for it. So that is a totally unique and new experience for me that I haven't really had. And in a lot of ways, I kind of want to convey a part of that attachment to the audience. Like, even if it's very small, It's still that, like, you have a stake in its survival, because like the direct connection of the piece, when you breathe into the CO2 sensor, it's this sort of metaphorical exchange of breath. Because when you breathe into that, like, your breath activates the aeration pumps, which actually help the cyanobacteria and the algae grow and become more vital. And in return, they are processing your CO2 into breathable oxygen on a very tiny scale, like super tiny. But I like that idea of that we're helping each other breathe.
Yeah, and it's still actually something happening, you know,
Yeah.
that you can interact. And I think you share that love,
Yeah.
if I can use that.
No, it's weird. I call them kiddos. I have actually called them kiddos several times before.
You share that love with Asa. It's like she told about her companions, you know. So it's like, and we owe them a lot of things, you know. Like you said, the oxygen at the starting point of growing.
Yeah, we could have had much different respiratory systems.